Welcome, everybody. My name's Fred Harrell. I'm the senior pastor at City Church San Francisco, if you don't know, and I'm really glad you're with us tonight. Happy Pride, everyone. Right on. We're really glad you're here with us tonight. City Church is a church that welcomes everyone to join in there and participate in the life of their church. We welcome all persons into our community, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, age, physical or mental capacity, education, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, and socioeconomic or marital status. Well, we had a lot of plans this year for Pride. We were preparing back in January and February. We had our already scheduled Friday nights. Every year during Pride, we do Gaga, glitter, and grilled meats at Jason Morell's home, and then we walk a few blocks over to the Trans March and cheer them on. And this year we had plans to be in the parade. So lots of things happened, but alas, COVID. And so here we are with this panel. And so, yeah, we're really excited. Also, just so you know, as a part of Pride, this Sunday at City Church, we have LGBTQ advocate and Newbigin House of Studies cohort fellow Julie Rogers will be preaching. So it should be a fantastic weekend. So we're really glad you've joined us here this evening. We have some folks from our community that are going to be on this panel tonight. Elliot, Katie, and Robin. I'll talk a little bit more about them in just a moment. And right out of the gate, let me just say that we all on this panel understand that we don't represent the broad diversity of the LGBTQ community. This panel is cis only. It's limited in its racial diversity. This panel knows it's not speaking for all of this LGBTQ plus community and all of its diversity, but nonetheless, we present ourselves tonight and our stories, and we hope this will be an engaging and fun conversation. If you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. We have Jason Morell, also known as the producer, who's in the background, who will be keeping us all squared away and feeding questions as that time comes along. Let me introduce our panel to you very quickly. First of all, Katie, just wave everybody, Katie. There you go. She grew up in Great Falls, Virginia, right outside of D.C., and attended Wellesley College in Massachusetts, where she received an undergraduate degree in American Studies. Knowing she wanted to become a teacher, she stayed on for a fifth year to get a teaching certification. Then she wanted to get a master's in early childhood education from Boston College. Go Eagles. Eagles, right? Yeah. And then began teaching kindergarten. 3 years later, her fiance at the time, Margaret, shout out to Margaret, took a UCSF job, so they moved to San Francisco, where Katie's been teaching third grade ever since. Margaret and Katie have been attending City Church since they moved here and are celebrating their second wedding anniversary this coming Tuesday. Another way is to celebrate. Yes, clap around, absolutely. And when not teaching, Katie enjoys board games, hiking, cooking, and playing with her dog, Scout, a terrific name for a dog. Okay, Elliot, wave everybody. Elliot, wave to Elliot. Elliot, you wave to them. There we go. All right, right on. Elliot grew up in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, about 40 minutes northwest of Pittsburgh, attended Messiah College in Central PA when he received an undergraduate degree in chemistry. He moved to Berkeley in the summer of 2017 and began a PhD program in physical chemistry at UC Berkeley. He began attending City Church regularly last September, and in part due to the communities that he's been a part of, in conjunction with our church, decided to make the move across the bay into San Francisco earlier this month. He enjoys theology, literature, food, and wine pairings, also crossword puzzles and Tillamook ice cream. Great combination. Hailing from the not-so-distant East Bay is Robin, wave Robin, is a Bay Area native and fifth-generation Chinese-American, barring a few years in San Diego and England for college and work. She's lived here her whole life and currently resides along the peninsula. Prior to COVID, she commuted to City Church regularly on Sundays and during the week for community gatherings over the past 2 years. And in 2019, she was a part of the Newbigin Fellows program, where she confirmed that she is indeed an Enneagram 6. While Robin's professional skills, that means that in every situation she's thinking, what's the worst thing that could happen here? Anyway, professional skills lie in marketing in the sports and video game industries. Her real passions are animals, hiking, and most recently playing Fortnite with City Church friends. Right on. So Katie, Robin, and Elliot, thank you for being here. We're really grateful that you would step out and be a part of this, and look forward to learning from all of you and hearing from your experiences. So I thought I'd start kind of broadly and then work more specifically. So just kind of broadly, let's kind of talk a little bit about your own faith journey, just briefly. How many of you, I think, were raised in church? If so, what kind of church? What was your early spiritual formation like? We'll start with Katie. You'll need to unmute before you talk. Yep.
I grew up in the church, in a non-denominational Christian church, going to church every Sunday, really all about church. Sunday school, Awana, you name it, I've done it. That's kind of what I was born and raised. I went to college and kind of took a step back for a moment. And then afterwards, and especially in Finding Margaret, we've kind of really gotten back into church and have been going pretty much since we started dating.
Wonderful. Thank you. Elliot?
Yeah, I think it's sort of a similar story in some ways. Very much grew up in the church, went to a Christian high school growing up. My first job was even at Chick-fil-A. Like every community that I was a part of was Christian in some way or another. And so, yeah, that's very much a part of my story.
I have a friend who does some marketing research with Chick-fil-A, and he says every time he goes to Atlanta, he goes, yeah, I'm flying out to talk to the Christian chickens.
Well, I mean, most people probably don't know this, but Chick-fil-A is actually a surprisingly gay company. We could have a whole other panel on that.
Oh, definitely. I see a Chick-fil-A panel coming on. I guess that is kind of the In and Out is kind of the version of that out here, except it's not chicken. But anyway. Okay, Robin.
Yeah, thank you for having this panel, and shout out to Jason, by the way. He's behind the scenes, but he is actually my Fortnite squad mate. So just gonna call that out. That's why I put that in there. For me, I actually didn't grow up in the church, so it's a unique experience for me whenever I guess, started going to churches, because I started going as an adult. So a lot of my context for church was like, I'm an adult and like, what is this like Sunday school thing people talked about? What are these songs everyone seems to know? And we can go more into it as we get through the questions. But I think one lens that I bring to the table is thinking about the lens of there's a lot of social capital that comes from growing up in a church and going through that experience that I think is something that should be recognized and acknowledged. So I'm very proud of like having gone to church in my journey. I think it's definitely shaped a lot of who I am. But it's also something that I think creates some sort of things where I may not know the songs that we're talking about, so then I have to ask the question of, can you send me the YouTube link for that? Or what are we all laughing about? I'm very confused right now. Or even calling people out and being like, that's probably not very funny anymore, but cool that you had that experience.
Yeah. One of the great privileges I have is really for all the 23 years I've been here is watching people who were raised in church, meeting people who were not raised in church, and then the people who were raised in church realizing they have an entire vocabulary that everybody else thinks is really weird. And we have to kind of like, that's one of the beauties of it actually, is because we get used to these little kind of Christian phrases that mean a lot. They're kind of the language of Zion. But then when someone says, what do you mean you wish traveling mercies for me? What does that mean? And then we're forced to kind of go, yeah, that is kind of an odd sounding, isn't it? One of the other things that I have the privilege of doing is hearing stories, especially over the years of being a pastor in San Francisco for 23 years, going on 24 in August, is I just get to hear hundreds of stories from people, and it's one of my favorite parts of my job. But in particular, hearing the stories of people who are coming to grips with the fact that they're Christians, but they're also understanding themselves to be gay. And understanding themselves to be a part of the queer community in some respect. And I wonder, can you share, it might be helpful to hear kind of your first memory of knowing that you might have to do some work in reconciling your faith with your sexual orientation? I mean, what was that like for you? Give us, if you so feel so led, to kind of give us an inside look at that. What was it like for each of you? Whoever wants to go first.
I can take this. I think my experience is very different from most people. I never had a problem with it. From the beginning, I kind of was like, oh, I'm a Christian and I'm gay. That's cool. My wife likes to joke that I'm a unicorn because that like doesn't happen. And as the more people we meet, the clearer it is that it is very different. The experience that I had was more for helping other people like do that journey. So my mom in particular at one point, asked me like, how can you be okay with being gay? Like, our pastor at our church wouldn't be okay with that. Like, how do you explain that to him? The best part of the story is that it all happened in a walk-in closet. So she was like putting me back in the closet.
Literally in a walk-in closet.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, I think for me, it was like, I didn't struggle with it. I think it was like trying to help people around me feel more comfortable with me not struggling with it.
Mm-hmm. So just total acceptance from your family as well, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it was a little bit of a journey, but from the beginning, they've been nothing but supportive. And as they understood it and stopped seeing it as just a thing I was going through, it's been nothing but supportive and love.
Thank you. Who'd like to go next?
Oh, we both unmuted at the same time.
Yeah.
Let it go, and then I'll go.
All right, I'll go. Yeah, I think my story is similar but different. I think I also somewhat uncommonly never had the like existential crisis of like, I am gay and Christian and one of these things has to go. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been a lot of sort of like flux in what that has meant for me at different points in my life. And I think that also, at least for me, doesn't take away some of the difficulties that I've had, both sort of more interpersonally, but then also in the context of Christianity and the church. Because it's sort of similar to what Katie was saying, that like self-acceptance or an idea that like, I don't know, I think for a lot of LGBT people, you just sort of realize that like your sexuality, or I can't speak to this directly, but your gender is just so innate that like, you just know that it's not going anywhere. And so, yeah, I think even with that, what it has looked like for me to hold on to being a gay man and a Christian has definitely been pretty dynamic over the course of my life. Mm-hmm. But I would say, to get directly to Fred's question, I think like 9th grade-ish at my Christian high school was when I sort of started realizing like, oh, life is going to look different for me than it does for most people around me.
Uh-huh. What was that like for you in 9th grade? I mean, that's such a tender age, right? I mean, it's pretty rough to have that kind of a realization at 14 or 15.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I don't know, I think, and this gets into some of the changes more specifically, but I think for me, my Christianity really had the flexibility to handle being gay. And at the time, it was very much something that I sort of cast in terms of like, this is a temptation that I'm dealing with. But even from that framework that I don't hold on to anymore, like that fits with Christianity, right? The idea that there might be something about you that like needs to be sanctified was not a problem for me. And so I didn't have an existential, like there's something deeply flawed with me that I think some LGBT people growing up in religious circles can have. And it just, I don't know, even, again, so much has changed in my theology since that time, but even then, pretty quickly I saw being gay as a blessing. It just really expanded my, I don't know, capacity and vocabulary for having empathy with other people. I think a lot of things in my life came pretty easily and naturally to me, and this was the first thing that I can remember being like, oh, this is not like fitting the scripts that it's supposed to. And I think for most people who have had experiences like that, like they're difficult, but at the end of the day, the blessings that you reap from them are just far and away above anything else.
I love that word empathy that you used. Whenever we go through trials of any kind, but especially these deep-seated, like who am I in relation to my faith, et cetera, and that go through that struggle, it seems like I've heard this so many times from others that their empathy, I don't know if they use this phrase, but the empathic imagination begins to expand. And so thank you for that, Elliot. How about you, Robin?
Yeah, my story is going back to the idea of not growing up in church.
Right.
Like, I actually didn't necessarily encounter the whole, like, maybe you got to work out, like, where you stand on this and if these things get along, until I was actually in church and starting the whole journey of, like, what does it look like to start a journey of, like, following Jesus and going through that. So when you asked that question, the memory that came to me was I was in a sort of like a seekers small group. So it's similar courses where, like, you're trying to figure out, like, who is Jesus? What is the church? What is God? And, like, you know, all those big questions that you learn in Sunday school, basically. But for me, it was like, let's compress this into a year and see what happens. This was all in college when, like, you're able to adapt to that. I think in my current moment, I'd be like, what am I doing and why is this happening? But in that, I remember actually, like, there was a moment where we were able to ask questions to our facilitators, and this was done through a church. So it was basically like a small group, but like a more guided small group, because everyone in that is like, I don't know what this Jesus thing is, and, like, what are we talking about? So you kind of have to basically go through that sort of training or, like, understanding of, like, what is church culture. So the question I submitted was along the lines of, like, so what does the Bible say about homosexuality? And I remember very distinctly, like, we went through a lot of hard questions, like, what is hell? Like, what are all these things? The question we did not go through was my question. And I thought that was very fascinating. And looking back on it, I have a lot of different thoughts that have developed over time. But my current thought is, like, why was that such a hard question? And looking back on that, to be succinct about it, people were able to informally talk about that, but in a formal setting, no one ever said anything about it. And I think that's so true for a lot of churches in general. There is a lot of informal conversation about that, but when you get to a point of being formal about it, it gets into this very gray area. And I think those are ways where, like, again, person who didn't grow up in church, so for me, like, even my family doesn't necessarily go to church, it strikes me as something that's interesting about being a Christian, where it's like, so are we trying to, like, get more people to kind of, you know, get to know Jesus and go through this process because we think Jesus is awesome? Is there something to be said about being clear about who Jesus is, being clear about what are we here for and what are we gathering about in something that is formalized? So that was kind of my first journey. Since then, like, there were several years where I was more like, okay, so I'm going to buy into this informal stuff that people are saying about it, which was essentially like, no, like, they can't really get along. But then I went through a journey where I was like, okay, let's actually take a step back and understand this and dig into it. But more or less, that was my first experience. And I find it interesting that it came directly from a church setting, that actually entered my brain and became something that I was like, is this part of a culture that exists in this world?
Interesting. Well, fascinating, because once you get into the formal conversations, then you're dealing with, you're kind of demanding a higher level of authenticity and truthfulness out of leaders, out of pastors, out of church boards, et cetera, and what the implications might be for you. Kept at an informal level, it's just everybody kind of stays in this gray morass. Yeah, I've heard that from others. You know, I'm wondering if you could share with us, like, what are some misconceptions that people might have about queer Christians? What, you know, what do people assume that you've kind of figured this out over the last few years? Like, people kind of assume what? Does anything come up for you when I ask that?
My immediate reaction is that queer Christians don't exist, number one. And number two is that they are operating on an extreme. And my response to those two things is, we're having this panel, so obviously we exist. Yes, you know, and I think part of it is, like, people just have to look hard enough. And I think there's some form of doubt about that too, going back to my earlier story. It's this sense of, like, so we can informally talk about what we can't formally talk about it. So I think there's something to be said about acknowledgement and the power that holds. To the second point about landing on extremes, to me, I think that was partly a preconception I held, but I think it's also something that makes it easy for us to other people when we put them on a certain extreme that makes it so, well, this person is on this thing and I don't think there's a connection point. So I feel like that's something that's important to re-examine, is, like, just because, you know, you may perceive that they're on this certain extreme, what does that mean for you? Are you using that as a way to facilitate a disconnection point? Or are you using that as a way to challenge yourself to consider, is this an opportunity for me to connect to them and to lean into that for myself, for my personal growth, and for that person as well?
Yeah. Thank you, Robin. Elliot or Katie?
For me, I think, like Robin was saying, I think the misconception that I hear around is just that, like, it can't be together. So you might be a Christian, you might be LGBTQ, but you can't be in the same space with both of those. And so when I'm at church, I'm the Christian part of me. And when I'm with my wife, I'm the LGBTQ part of me. And I think for me, it's like understanding, for people to understand that, you know, I bring my whole self there, and that means that maybe viewing the Bible through that LGBTQ lens, or viewing my experiences in church through that LGBTQ lens, kind of helps me have an experience that maybe others don't, that they have experiences with lenses that I don't have.
That's great. That's kind of getting to what Elliot talked a little bit about there's a certain gift to be received in being a part of this community. And I can say as a pastor, it's a gift, and having LGBTQ folks with their lens and their experience is such a gift to our congregation. Elliot, what common misconceptions?
I think the biggest one I want to hone in on is that, like, it's a struggle to be LGBT and being a Christian. And, like, I think, like most misconceptions, there's a kernel of truth or something like truth in that then gets blown up into a much bigger assumption about what my or our experiences are like. And I think for me, it's been helpful to sort of distinguish between, like, intrinsic and extrinsic struggles, right? And I think most people have this assumption that there's this deep intrinsic struggle, right? That there's something core and fundamental about being both LGBT and a Christian, and being a Christian, that causes strife or suffering or struggle, just to continue with that word. Whereas I've sort of realized in my experience that most of the difficulties posed are actually extrinsic to me. They're extrinsic to my own faith, my own theology. They're imposed from various church structures or social structures that might exist. And I think in talking to lots of different LGBT Christians who are sort of all across the theological map, I think there's something approaching uniformity that for most people, the deepest struggles that they experience are due to the pressures put on them, not to anything that they perceive for themselves, for their own faith.
That's a good word. It's less internal and more external forces that are creating a lot of the dissonance in whatever form that may take. Yeah, great. And so what was it like finding City Church for the three of you? And this panel is not a rah-rah for City Church. As I try to say every single week, we aspire to be an inclusive community, and we know we have a long way to go. And so honestly, you know, what was it like finding City Church? But also I'd love to hear, you know, and for our congregants who are listening and others, what's a growth edge, an opportunity for growth for City Church specifically? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I nominate Elliot because he has some good thoughts on it. I just want to call that out first.
So the first part of the question, like, what's it like finding City Church? Man, that's tough. I think largely because there's so much backstory to that sort of shapes what it was like for me to start attending City Church. But I think the way that I can sum it up the quickest is, I think it was my second Sunday. If you haven't been to our church, like a lot of more liturgical type churches, there's a moment where sort of the children come up to the front of the service and they receive a blessing before leaving to go do their little studies. And I remember, I think it was the second time that I came to the church, during that blessing, I just was overwhelmed by the emotion of realizing that, like, just statistically speaking, some number of these children are going to be LGBT, and they're growing up in a context that doesn't have those extrinsic pressures that I talked about, or at least has a lot less of them than what I grew up with. And it just, it brought me to tears. I cry a lot in church, but it really struck me.
Because of the preaching, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure. Go ahead, keep on going.
But that really was powerful to me. And a similar note of realizing that like there wasn't anything that I could do that would put me outside the bounds of the community, I think was also a similarly powerful realization that happened early on, and I think is not necessarily common for churchgoers. So that's the first bit. I feel like I've been doing a lot of talking.
You want to come back to the second bit?
Yeah, let's come back to the growth.
Okay. Let's do part A and part B on this question. Katie or Robin want to address part A? Go ahead, Katie.
I can jump in. So before we came to City Church, we lived in Boston, and we went to a church in Boston that we knew was not affirming, but all of Margaret's friends went there, so we had that community. And it was tough. Like we felt like we couldn't hold hands. We probably could have. Like they weren't going to kick us out, but it felt like we weren't okay being ourselves there. We thought about, at some point we want to have kids. What's that going to look like? So before we moved to San Francisco, we knew it was a priority to find an affirming church. And Margaret went to the internet and found City Church and found everything, including the letter, which you can find online. And, we said, City Church seems like it's a place we need to check out. And the second we landed in San Francisco, or we drove, and got here, the first Sunday we went, and we've been going ever since. And I think the ability to bring our whole selves, at least for my wife and me, we can hold our hands. When I also cry all the time at church, definitely because of Fred, my wife can put her arm around me, and we don't have to feel weird about that. So, it allowed me to not only just bring my whole self, but to want to be more involved and to get involved with children's ministry, because I wasn't afraid, what are parents going to think that this gay person is teaching their kid? To get involved with a small group, which I'd never done before, because I had this huge part of myself I was hiding from everybody. So City Church has been really powerful for me, and that's not to say that everything's perfect, and part B is where we will get into that, but
yeah, please do.
It's been really, really great for me.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, I think, so I grew up in the Bay Area, and I've been to a number of different churches throughout the region. And I'll say finding City Church, one, I still would commute there when we're not in COVID, but it is a consideration I have to make regularly, because that is time invested. I am working, so there is a degree of how am I spending my time on this? Sure. But for me, it's been really worth it. It's been super valuable. Part of that journey was trying out different churches. It just felt like there was something missing. I was I don't know what it is. I'd never been to an affirming church before, but I was just you know what? We're just going to try this out. We're going to see what's happening. It happened to coincide with doing New Begin, was really the timing that I also did City Church, and I also decided to check out the LGBT CG. That was a wild year, let me just tell you, because I was commuting 3 times a week to the city, and I was starting a new job at the time. That was the reverse direction.
We almost named you most valuable City Churcher that year. You were so involved.
Thank you. I actually really appreciate that. And yeah, I'm looking for my trophy now. I'm oh man.
Yeah. In the mail.
But it's in the mail. But yeah, I'll say I just thought the metaphor of it's just night and day being at City Church and being at the other churches I've been at, even if they had a bigger budget or cooler stuff, whatever it is that makes your church cool. I think that there was a part of me that it took time to recognize it was night and day. And I'm calling that out because I think about how sunsets and sunrises, you got to sit with it for a while, and then you start to see the beauty of it. That's kind of how I felt City Church was, where I was I don't know about this. They also do a lot of these things where it's standing, sitting, we're reading this thing, how much paper is being used? I know everyone's had these questions.
Absolutely.
But I think it just grew into that. And I think my key thing that really helped out was having a church-supported community group I hit it off with Katie and Margaret, so we became friends around the Super Bowl. Really is like our timing that we kind of tied to, but like I think finding people that can understand the story that you have, and like I don't have to ask questions really of like what was it like doing this, whatever. Like I can understand like parts of that story, and I think that's so important for anyone who identifies as LGBTQ, is that when you meet people that have that, there is that shared connection that like is so valuable and so unsaid. And I think that's something that's been really key for City Church, is having that and having something that can tie us together so that we can also grow with the church too in parallel, which then we'll get into part B.
Yeah, I mean, I really want us to get into part B because, you know, on this broadcast, there'll be other pastors. There'll be folks who are in churches that are also affirming, and I hope can learn from what we do well and what we don't do well and what we need to improve on. So we welcome that feedback. So I'd love to hear, it's like, what do you think are some growth edges for City Church as we seek to be a church that's inclusive? Elliot, I think you're up.
All right. Yeah, I like to talk sort of to your point about sort of the little C church, which is whatever congregation you find yourself in, and the big C church, which is Christians everywhere. And I think both things that I want to say to this question apply to both of those churches, right? The little C church that is the community of City Church people, but I think in my experience of the broader capital C church that both of these things really apply to. And the two things that I'm going to say, they kind of remind me of a yoga pose in the sense that they might feel like they're stretching in opposite directions. And the more that you reach towards one, the less you're able to reach towards other. But I think the tension of having both of those things be something that you're striving for, or we're striving for in our church, I think is really important. And so the first is towards broader inclusion of LGBT. Well, I guess they're both broader inclusion of LGBT people, but the first is sort of in a more standard way of what people might think when you say that. And so I'm thinking specifically about ways that City Church could be more inclusive of trans and gender nonconforming people. I have a friend who is a gender educator, and I went to one of his sessions once. And one of the things that he mentioned is that in a city like San Francisco, if you don't have trans and gender nonconforming people at your church, it's not because there aren't trans and gender nonconforming Christians in your city. It's because for some reason they don't feel safe or comfortable or welcomed in the walls of your building.
Hello.
And I thought that was a really prescient and just a really had, he really had his finger on something important there. And so I don't know, I think the fact that this panel is all cis people, and it's not that our entire church is all cis people, but just the degrees of representation there, I think, are telling. And
good.
I think some specific things that our church, other churches, again, a lot of this comes from my friend's session, would be things like having name tags. Name tags are clunky, but they're a place where you can put your pronouns, and that's something that makes spaces feel safer for people who are misgendered. And so I think that's one key example. I think being more cautious about the language we use. It's really common to go back to sort of church jargon at the beginning of our conversation to say brothers and sisters. That's a really common phrasing that people use both informally and formally. And I think switching that to something like siblings, fewer syllables, so you have to say less, but it also includes more people, which is, of course, the more important part.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of the one thing. And then the other direction is I've sort of come to different points in my own theological journey and journey with different churches. But I think affirming LGBT Christians in some ways actually have it easier than non-affirming LGBT Christians when it comes to finding communities of faith that accept them. That's not universally true, and I wouldn't want to deny any of the struggles that any LGBT Christian or person has found on their journey to sort of be accepted in communities. But I think most non-affirming churches do an exceptionally terrible job at welcoming even celibate LGBT Christians into their communities. it's there's a whole lot of reasons why that might be the case. But I think it then becomes, both because of that reality and apart from it, I think it's incumbent upon more affirming churches to ask the question of what it looks like to be a space where even those people who don't share the theological convictions of the church can flourish, and to do that in a way that isn't patronizing, right? That isn't saying, you're here now, but eventually you'll come to agree with us, but in a way that really allows people to belong. And I think there's sort of two quotes on that line I wanna sort of lean into. One is from a woman named Sarah Bessey, who's a Christian writer. And I was at a conference where she spoke once, and she talked about avoiding Christian fundamentalism or progressive fundamentalism. Right? We often think about fundamentalism being a conservative thing, but asking what it means and really praying that our communities would be spaces that don't have that same fundamentalism. And then I think part of the key to that comes from a prayer book that actually my mother, who's tuned into this, sent to me. And it's a really short prayer, but it says, "May I have enough faith in the truth that I happily abandon the temptation to sell it." And I think that's a good word.
It is a good word.
Yeah. And so, yeah, that's sort of my yoga pose, stretching towards being a space that allows trans and gender nonconforming people who are often, at least in terms of rights and acceptance, on the fringes of the LGBT community, and then also in the complete other direction, celibate LGBT people who are on the opposite fringe, and just asking the question of how
do we include everyone?
Can expand. Yeah.
Such a good word. Thank you, Elliot. Anybody else want to jump on that a little bit? Growth edges for City Church?
Yeah, I'll go. I think, so it's two different things. The first one is, I think of top down and bottom up. So I'm going to start with bottom up approach. I think for one thing we do well is like giving resources. I think we can continue to do that well, though, is like sharing resources out for what can we talk about, what can we do. This relates to my top down one, where we talk about having a LGBT group and a community and so forth. And this is something new to me that I started thinking more critically about, but all of us here can kind of talk to, like, this was what the experience was like, here's kind of what happened, and we have that lived in experience. My question becomes, ultimately, we have some power, but it needs to come from everyone who can speak from being informed about that, because once you are informed about what the problem is, then you can get into solutions. And what I mean by problem, it's in broad strokes, like, we're having a panel about this because we are a unique group, right? There are things that we encounter that other people may not. There are places where we want to go to church, but we cannot go to church. So I think that's naming what the problem is in broad strokes again. So from a top down, all of us here can talk about what that problem is very, very fluently, maybe in different degrees, but like we can all speak to what that is. I think there's a opportunity to go top down in terms of asking, so what are the other community groups up to? Like, why is it on our group to kind of talk about our lived-in experience for it? Not that I don't want to have a panel per se, but in the same way that we are approaching, like, let's talk about the Sunday sermon, let's talk about the Bible. Why are we not doing that for these other things that we can truly act upon? Why is there not a straight family group that is actually engaging very, very strategically on the issue of why are we not having more LGBT community in churches? Why is that an issue? So we are able to all be allies in that conversation, all talk to that and be on the same page. I think that's something that top down for a lot of different issues, there is that onus of responsibility on where everyone can be a part of the solution if we all acknowledge this is what the problem is. And I think that's where you get into real power and real change.
Such good stuff. Thank you, Robin. Really appreciate that. Very thoughtful and helpful. Katie, what comes up for you?
I think for me, it's tying in with what Robin was saying of just like, it feels at times that it's so separated at City Church. Like the gays sit in the back and we have our section and we love it. Don't get me wrong, but I'd love to like know some people that aren't LGBTQ. I'd love to, connect more with people. And obviously part of that is on me because I've gotten comfortable in this group that I identify with. I think part of it is also on how do we as a church come together and create places that feel comfortable with for everybody to be able to connect and to have those connections. And I think one other thing that City Church does fairly well, but as a bigger church family that needs to be remembered, is that the church has hurt a lot of LGBTQ people. And to pretend that it hasn't when churches suddenly become affirming is a lie that is damaging and hurtful, and it goes back to what Elliot was saying is part of the reason why you don't see certain groups in the walls of the church.
Really good. Thank you, Katie, for that. Along those lines, what is your suggestion to folks about what it means? Because I think this kind of connects into it a little bit. What does it mean to be a great ally to LGBTQ community? What comes up for you whenever I ask that question?
I think of I'm gonna give Jason another shout out, but the other day he sends me this article of something that had happened in the LGBT community, and I did not know this had happened. Mind you, I was very preoccupied with some other things happening, but to me that was great allyship in that he didn't even have me prompt him. He just literally just sends me this thing. He's like, hey, I saw this happen. And we were partly just kind of discussing and being friendly about it. But it also was just something that to me made me feel super welcomed and acknowledging that he is on it. He is I am fully invested in knowing what's up with this community. And so that's why that's my growth edge, is looking top down in terms of I am not the person in power in this situation. I am a woman, I am Chinese American, I also identify as LGBT. So there's all these different pieces there. So when people within a group that has more power can speak to that, can be on that same page, I think that's a moment where I feel great allyship is really exhibited. One thing I'll call out on the ally topic is to be a great ally, you have to acknowledge that you are not giving yourself the position of ally. You are bestowed that title. So I think that's really important to recognize, is that's something that you're continuously working on and growing in. And that's something that you have to continually practice. I think, Fred, you do a great job when every single Sunday, I super focus in specifically on that words of welcome, which you gave at the beginning of this, because that to me is a reminder, not just for myself that I'm welcome, but to the rest of the congregation, acknowledging, hey, I am in charge of what's happening here, not necessarily in different degrees, but you are you're the pastor, right? But hearing that from the very top and hearing that said, I think that really dictates what the culture is in that moment. And that to me, one, makes me feel welcome and also protected. Not you necessarily need that, but some people really will feel that sort of affirmation in themselves. And that allows me to kind of grow and flourish in ways that otherwise I would probably be preoccupied as the Enneagram 6 of, oh my gosh, what's the worst thing that could happen at this point? Now I'm worried about not being welcomed because they didn't say I was welcome.
Right. Yeah. And not to get on a different topic, but that's so important given the history of what people have when they come into our congregation who are LGBTQ, because they've been a part of congregations where they were told they were welcome and then they found out they actually weren't. I remember one conversation, I'll get to the other two. I was talking to someone, I don't know, it was 3 or 4 months ago, back when we were before COVID. And I said, so, what's your experience been like so far? They've been 3 Sundays. And she looked at me and she said, well, I'm LGBTQ and you are 3 for 3 in welcoming me. So I'm halfway to believing that I'm actually welcome here, which I just thought was such a fascinating commentary on her past experience and the experience I've heard from so many others. So anyway, Katie or Elliot, what comes up for you when I ask the question, what does it mean to be a great ally?
I think for me, it's being an ally is being an ally for anything. In this current moment, there's a lot of talk around allies for the Black community. I think the allyship that takes place for one is very similar to the other, obviously with a few extra things thrown in for each group because they're different. But for me, being a good ally starts with supporting individuals and the whole community. So it's awesome that you're saying you support me, Katie Lynn Martori, as this human being. But if you go and you vote for somebody who puts out policies that are really against the LGBTQ community, you aren't an ally, right? You haven't shown that it's more important to me as your friend, as your family member, that you aren't willing to sacrifice this other piece, and not even sacrifice, you're not willing to support this other piece, because I think it's so easy. And what I heard when I came out to a lot of people in the beginning was, oh, well, we love you so much and you're so important to us, and like obviously we support you. And then on the flip side, like seeing things that weren't supporting the whole community of LGBTQ people. So I think that's super important to me. The second one is speaking up against prejudice. So when you hear someone say something that doesn't feel right, it's not right, and you should try to stop it. And that's a long one that I'm going to leave there. The third one is educate yourself. Don't rely on someone from the community to be the one that has to teach you it. Yes. That's a big one going around right now. The fourth one is be comfortable being uncomfortable. People are going to make mistakes, and we I as a member of the LGBTQ community are not going to hate you and never speak to you again. Mistakes mean you're trying, and that's all we really want. Recognize when you've made a mistake, be willing to learn from that mistake and move forward. And then the two that I think are important LGBT specific ones are check your language with pronouns, particularly like Elliot was talking earlier, and with assumptions. The amount of times when I was engaged, I would say my fiance, and they would say, oh, what does he do? Right. It just, it shuts you down. It puts up a wall. It makes you not want to, be all included in that conversation or in that relationship. So assumptions are tough. And then the second one is show up for more than just Pride. Pride is awesome. We get it. It's a cool party and a cool parade. But also do the work when it's not something that's really cool and really popular. Pride's become this huge popular thing. So yeah, show up for more than just Pride.
Just want to pause for a second and say, jazz hands for that. Such a great response. I want to go back and write down every single one of those. Man, fantastic. Thank you. Elliot, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I'm glad I didn't prepare specifics because they would all have been knocked off by Katie. I think for me, I want to answer this question by asking what it means to be an ally in sort of an abstract way. And I think at the end of the day, allying yourself to another person is respecting their autonomy. And you cannot be an ally to someone when you're telling them what to do, just to put it quite starkly. And that's something that I often struggle with when I'm trying to be an ally to other people, even if there are other people within the LGBT community, even if there are other gay people, right? Like, I can still often find myself trying to step into the role where, like, I have the answers and they get them from me. Where, I think allyship is at its core about respecting autonomy and saying, this other person says this is what they need, and so I'm going to do the best that I can to provide that for them, where that's something that is incumbent upon me, and work to create spaces where they can provide that for themselves as well. So,
yeah, that's great. You all kind of touched into what I wanted to make sure we cover for just a moment, which is, I'm asking you the question about what does it mean for you to be an ally, or what does it mean for to be a great ally to your community, and at the same time, you are locating yourself as allies as well. I mean, we're in the midst of this big moment right now where there's some pretty big sea change happening in terms of how we understand race in America. Some massive changes that need to be, well, they're not massive yet. We're going to hope they're massive, right? But there's certainly a lot of movement. I just wonder, talk to us a little bit about how you locate yourself right now in the midst of that kind of a movement. The Black Lives Matter moment in particular that we're in right now. How are these interrelated? How they find themselves in conflict with one another? What comes up for you when you think about that?
Yeah, that's one that I think all of us are trying to navigate and locate in a very interesting fabric of, we're also in this COVID moment too. And, I'll just say, again, none of us are fully like representing the community or specialists in it in any way, but I would say that in this moment, I really acknowledge the idea of until all of us are free, none of us are free.
Hello.
And I think that's something that the LGBTQ community can really identify and look to. There's also a growth edge for the LGBTQ community in that a lot of the leadership and historical figures that have a lot of recognition are white men. And I think there's something to be said there that I think the community is evaluating and looking at and kind of having to address. And I would say like that's something that we have to be mindful of and look at. But yeah, I think in general for me, like any human here who I hope is tuning in, it's about really listening and acknowledging that in this moment, as we look at race relations in America, it is about Black racism. It is about that specifically. There are obviously other pressing matters at hand, but that is the moment that we are specifically looking at. And that is what a lot of, I would say, like in this month, the LGBTQ community has been looking at how can we also try and support that. So we can't even have parties anyway because of COVID, right? But how can we use, our resources, our ways that we've looked at, like we have been oppressed too, to help look at and understand like helping other oppressed communities as well, and leveraging resources and kind of aligning on that, because there will be a moment where, the LGBT community will have, hopefully like nothing happens, but there will be a moment where there is a growth opportunity, right? So I think that is always important, no matter where you're looking at, for us to be present in that and to be very supportive and to not just make this like Katie named like, don't just show up for Pride. And similar, we're not just showing up for Juneteenth. I hope we're not doing that. So I think that's something that I personally am trying to commit myself to and really acknowledge and learn a lot about and continue to grow in.
Great.
Yeah, I think tying in with what Elliot said earlier of, becoming an LGBTQ Christian, helps lead to understanding and feeling more empathy towards others. I had this feeling of otherness put on me from other people. And so having that experience, starts to help me understand, like Robin was saying, the importance of recognizing when others are feeling othered, and being able to show up and be an ally for those people. I think the area that I worry about, or the conflict that I see, is when we start to feel or believe that because we've had these challenges, we can understand the experience that others have had, that the Black community has had, because they're not the same. And so I think that's the one area that I'm reminding myself and trying to check other LGBTQ people to say, yes, the history of LGBTQ in America has not always been great. And that doesn't mean we know one bit of what it must be like to be a Black person in America. Even though I felt othered, I've never had, I have the luxury of being able to pass as heterosexual a lot. Something that someone in the Black community, for the many people in the Black community, don't have the privilege of doing. While there is violence that is done towards LGBTQ people, I've never had the experience of violence done towards me. I don't wake up every morning worried that something might happen to me or my family because of what I look like. And so I think that it's just important to recognize that while we want to be allies, we need to make sure that we're not saying, I've had a struggle and my struggle is the same as yours, so I know what you're going through.
Wow. So good. Thank you, Katie. Yeah.
I don't have much to add to either of those, but I think the final piece is just that, or a final piece is that these aren't separate, both in the history of the LGBT rights movement and the Black rights movement, and in sort of our current day, that there are, of course, lots of Black LGBT people, and historically they have in a lot of ways carried way more than their own weight in terms of the civil rights movement, the civil rights movement, the LGBT rights movement.
Yeah.
And so I think particularly for non-Black LGBT people, reading the works of people like Audre Lorde or James Baldwin, or reading more about the Stonewall riots, or just really learning our history is an important way to sort of remember who we are, and
who we are and where we've come from, and what the broadness and the expansiveness of the LGBTQ community's diversity, that in all aspects must be celebrated and remembered. And if we remember Stonewall, we go back and remember the centrality of trans folks who were right in the very heart of why we even have Pride today. Because as some of us know, I imagine a lot of us know on this call, that that initial Pride March was not all fun and games, and a nice beautiful float with lots of people throwing swag out into the crowd. And so with that, I want to come to our final thing, because I want to make sure if there's any questions, we'll have a little bit of time for that. But just kind of what comes to mind for you, and it can be maybe just think of a short little quick answer, because I really kind of want it to be whatever comes up for you. What does Pride mean to you?
I can tackle this first, because I, as a teacher, had the opportunity to do some thinking about this, because this year I decided that while we only spent 5 days of June in school, I was going to make the most of it and teach about Pride, which I'd never done before. And so I took a lot of time to think, what does Pride mean to me? And I took time to think, where does the word Pride even come from? Because there's no super clear answer to that. A lot of the information that I used and ties nicely in with the 50-year anniversary of San Francisco Pride right now, and thinking about those people that are heroes for us or role models for us. Brenda Howard was a huge person that came up with the word Pride. For those of you that don't know who she is, she was a bisexual woman who had had her hand in a lot of the beginning plannings of those Pride parades, and thinking about Pride, and someone I definitely look up to. And for me, Pride means having pride in myself and being happy and excited, and feeling like I am enough. Sorry, it chokes me up to say these things. And recognizing that, God made me the way that I am, and I'm awesome just that way.
That's right. Oh, thank you, Katie.
Yeah, you are.
Yeah, you are.
See, Fred made me cry again. It happens every time.
I love that so much.
Yeah, my answer is super short. But yeah, I have super appreciated being friends with Katie and Elliot and Fred and Jason as well. But I would say for me, Pride means liberation. I think I like that word because it's active, right? I think it's something we're continuously growing in. And I think it's something we can continuously act towards and grow towards. I also think about the way that Jesus came to, liberate people. And I think that's a powerful image that I personally hold when I think about it. But yeah, it's for sure a party, but also I think it just has a deeper meaning behind it when you think to the moment of what was happening before, because it was definitely in some people who are still living on this earth, it was in that lifetime that a lot of this was still happening, and it's still very much something that is not true. There are people that are not liberated in certain countries, certain places.
Right.
So I think it's important to call out that Pride is not something that is fully acknowledged on this earth. And until that happens, that's why liberation is my word, that I really like for that. It is something that we have to continuously act on and act towards in whatever way we can, whether micro or macro, on individual things or things we do as groups and collectives. But I think that's very important. And that's why liberation equals pride, pride equals liberation to me.
Love it. Love it. I love that word, liberation, Robin. Thank you. Elliot?
Yeah, I think this is another place where church language can trip us up a little bit, because pride's a sin, right?
Yes.
And I think that was something I had to do some gymnastics with for a while.
Yeah.
And then I think it was last year, it might have been before that, but someone pointed out to me that when we talk about pride in the context of Pride Month, LGBT Pride, we're not talking about pride as opposed to humility.
Right.
We're not talking about pride as arrogance. We're talking about pride as opposed to shame. And so from that, pride is, and I think that framing of what pride is what makes it something not only that Christians can get behind, but something that Christians should very much be for, right? Because sort of like Robin was talking about, coupled to liberation is being brought out of shame. That's a very central idea to Christianity, is that Christ brings us out of our shame. And so, yeah, I think that, similar to what Katie was saying, pride is about saying, you know what, this is who I am. And this piece of who I am is not something that is a challenge to God. It's not something that God is surprised by. And being able to name and recognize all the ways that, in fact, the things that I'm proud about, being a gay man, have blessed my life in ways that are so enmeshed with Christian virtues, non-Christian, like other virtues as well, if you wanted to have that conversation, or if you aren't a person of Christian faith. And being able to name those things and own them and not feel like they have to be hidden, either to myself, to God, or to other people.
Wow, so good. Pride is, I'm enough. I'm actually awesome. God delights in me. Pride is liberation. I love that. The liberation of knowing that I'm God's beloved child and that I don't have to live in the shackles of, to get into Elliot's thing, shame. That it's pride as opposed to shame. And that's, if there's, I think I've said this many times on Sundays before, but if I had to summarize the gospel into just a couple of ideas, it's as simple as they could be, would be that you are fully known and fully loved. That's a really powerful combination. To be fully known and fully loved is to know that you are delighted in by God. You are liberated from all the ways in which the voices and the messages and all the different things, of the cacophony of noise out there that tries to shackle me, and that it's pride as opposed to shame. The gospel comes to liberate us from that as well. I just love the way you all have talked about this. I don't think we have any questions, and I'll tell you why. People have been so busy pushing the heart button the whole time you've been talking, and the like button, and the yay, and the claps. I mean, every now and then, if you've noticed, I've kind of look off to my left. I can't really pay attention to it too much, but I'm looking over at the comments over here, and I see Scott Peterson saying pride is being made in the image of God. Absolutely. Yes, God made each of you and loves you. Krista Martinez Padua, she was in Boston and was a part of my RUF group way back in the 90s. And just everybody there is just like, they don't have questions. They just want to clap and tell you how much they love this. And I love what Paul Trudeau put. I want to read that to you as well. He said, I bestow the title of ally upon our LGBTQ City Church community for my friends here in the Tenderloin. You bring the heart and the muscle behind us serving the most marginalized in the Tenderloin. You serve faithfully, joyfully, and generously. We couldn't do it without you. Amen. Amen. I've seen that many times. Ellen Yang, so blown away with the wisdom and the powerful words. I just can't say enough about how much I appreciate the three of you being willing to be a part of this. Put it out there, and really just such a gift. You, the three of you, are such a gift to our community and to other communities who are going to watch this beyond this time, because what we've learned from all of these things we've done is that there's the in-moment interaction that takes place, and then there are the hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, I hope that doesn't scare you to death, that are going to watch this as well. I know that Jason told me not too long ago that we're in close to 100 countries have watched different things we've done on this live stream, so which is just mind-boggling. But your words tonight, I guarantee you, landed. It landed on people who wondered if they're enough, to use your word, Katie. It landed on people, Robin, who wondered if they too can feel liberation as a gay person in this country and as a gay Christian. They landed on people, Elliot, who wanted to know if they can live a life that's not full of shame, but actually full of pride in the best sense of that word. There's no question in my mind that that happened tonight. And I know it did for all of us listening right now, but ministry is always this way, right? There's the moment in which you do something that, a few people like we see here are just so, appreciative of, and they put it in the comments. But then there's all the things you're not going to hear, or that you might hear in 5 years or 10 years. But there were things said tonight that were powerful and life-giving. And you have been just fantastic to be a part of this. So we want to thank you for this. Thank you for your wisdom. And I think with that, we're just going to end with that, just with a lot of appreciation and gratefulness. And we're finishing kind of on time, which is a miracle. So thank you to all three of you. Again, shout out to Jason Harrell and so many others who helped make this possible. Thanks for joining us tonight, friends, for this Pride panel. We invite you to everything we do at City Church. The next time we gather together is going to be Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Again, Julie Rogers is going to be preaching. Fantastic preacher, a person who was involved in our New Begin program, both as a student and now as a cohort fellow. And we invite you to be a part of that on Sunday. So thanks for joining us this evening. Go in God's peace as we continue to seek to follow Christ to renew the city. Thanks for being a part of this.